Hello, everyone. A very good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and my fellow students, it is my honor to welcome you to this Pearson Institute and IOP Speaker Series event titled The Future of Modi's India. I am Rini Cherian, a first-year MPP student at the Harris School and a Pearson Fellow with the Pearson Institute of the Study of Resolution of Global Conflicts. As we gather here today to discuss the future of India, we find ourselves amidst a pivotal moment in history. The upcoming election in the world's largest democracy resonates not only within the boundaries of India, but across the globe. Against the backdrop of ethnic tensions, religious polarization, nationalist fervor, and the omnipresent specter of misinformation, this election season presents challenges and opportunities unlike any other. Amidst these complexities, as an Indian, I feel it is essential to address some pressing issues such as the ongoing farmers' protests in Delhi, climate fast protests by residents in Ladakh, and the tragic communal violence in Manipur in the northeast of India. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to today's esteemed panelists, who bring a wealth of expertise and insight to this topic. Our first panelist for today is Mr. Shuja Nawaz, a native of Pakistan, was the founding director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in January 2009, and is currently a distinguished fellow at the center. A political strategist and analyst, Mr. Nawaz writes for leading newspapers and websites and speaks on current topics before civic groups, many think tanks, and on radio and television worldwide. Our second panelist, Ms. Safiya Gori Ahmed, is Senior Director with APCO Worldwide, leading the firm's global public affairs work in Washington, D.C. She recently served as Senior Managing Director and Partner at McLarty Associates, a global consulting firm based in Washington, where she advised Fortune 500 companies on policy issues and market entry strategies in South Asia for 6 years. Ms. Gori Ahmed regularly speaks on topics related to DEI, women empowerment, and foreign policy. Our third panelist is Dr. Paul Staniland, a professor of political science and faculty chair of the Committee on International Relations. His research focuses on political violence and international security, with regional focus on South and Southeast Asia. His latest book, Ordering Violence, Explaining Armed Group-State Relations from Conflict to Cooperation, was published by Cornell in 2021. And lastly, our moderator, Ms. Emily Schmall, is a correspondent of the New York Times and was formerly based in New Delhi. She came to the Times from the Associated Press, where she covered South Asia and before that, Texas. Previously a roving foreign correspondent, she wrote from a dozen countries across 5 continents. She holds a bachelor's degree in Spanish from Bard College and a master's in journalism from Columbia University. Before we proceed with the event, I'd like to take a moment to mention some housekeeping rules. Firstly, I kindly ask everyone to silence or turn off their cell phones to minimize disruptions during our discussion. During the event, we'll be opening the floor for questions from the audience. When the time comes, a microphone will be placed in the audience for those wishing to ask questions. Please line up, and remember we prioritize questions for students, so don't hesitate to step forward. In addition, after tonight's discussion ends, food will be served in the lobby area. Now, I'd like to take a moment to highlight the next 2 speaker series events that have been lined up. On Monday, April 15, the IOP will host Journalists on the Front Lines, a year of war and conflict. That event will take place at 5:30 p.m. at the Chicago Theological Seminary. The next Pearson speaker event will feature journalist Juanita Velez as she discusses her new book, One War Later, which talks about the peace and reconciliate process in Colombia. This event will take place on Tuesday, April 30th at 12:30 p.m. here at Keller Center. I encourage everyone to visit the IOP website and Pearson Institute website for more information on future events. With that, let's extend a warm welcome to our expert panel.
Well, yeah, disco, that's an interesting transition. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. This is such a great an event. Here we are, it's springtime in Chicago, although that's still mainly theoretical, I think. But in New Delhi, the central seat of power in India, things are really heating up. We're on the cusp of sweltering temperatures there and a 6-week election season as India decides whether to keep the reigning Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, at the helm. In my nearly 5 years reporting from India, nothing was as physically demanding as covering the elections, a truly mammoth exercise. Since 1951, the year of newly independent India's first elections, officials have traveled across the length and width of the subcontinent to bring universal suffrage to the people of India. This year, officials and security forces will travel by foot, boat, and on horseback across mountains, desert, jungle, and the sea. Voting begins April 9th and stretches over 44 days in 7 rounds of polling. 969 million Indians are eligible to vote, more than all the residents of the EU. No voter will have to travel more than just a little over a mile to cast a vote. And India is electing 543 lawmakers for the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. Results should be known June 4th. We have a very esteemed panel, and I'd like all of you today to please address the question of what is at stake in these elections, both for India, for the larger South Asia region, and for democracies around the world. And as you do this, I want to start with you, Professor Staniland. I'd like to start by asking you to please lay out for us a little bit the context about the political conditions in which this vote is taking place. How dominant is the BJP under Narendra Modi, and what is the state of the opposition?
Great, thanks. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. So political scientists often think about there being 4 party systems in India. This is the 4th party system. The first was between 1947 and the mid-1960s. This was the height of kind of the Congress party system after independence. And then the second party system was from the mid-1960s until the 1989, which was a kind of uneven period mixing overall Congress dominance with a variety of especially state-based challenges to Congress. This culminates in Congress basically losing power in 1989 and the rise of the coalition era between 1989 and 2014, in which to kind of build and maintain power in Delhi, parties needed to cobble together coalitions, whether Congress-led or BJP-led. Since 2014, the BJP has really established a fairly dominant position at the national level and in a number of Indian states, especially in North India. And I think what we're likely to see in this election, I'm not an election prognosticator, but all indications are that the BJP will win another fairly resounding victory. We'll see what the contours of that look like. I was in Delhi in January, and the question was like, not will the BJP win, but by how much, right? We'll see, but I think that's at least the general kind of conventional wisdom. So I think this has some important implications for how we think about Indian politics. The BJP is a complicated, very powerful political party. And I think you see the BJP in power acting in several ways that shape the nature of Indian democracy. First, this is a party that emphasizes and kind of thrives on mobilization and elections. It likes to win. It likes to defeat the opposition and kind of revels in that. So it's not a party they're parties that try to demobilize, that try to depoliticize the political arena. The BJP is not one of them. It thrives on mobilization. And, mass rallies, an extremely active prime minister with, a very active kind of public profile. So it's a mobilized polity in certain ways. Second, it's a party that I think sees itself very much as having an ideological mission, a project to kind of reshape how the Indian nation is understood. Right? And this includes an effort to really reach into a variety of parts of Indian society, whether it's academia or the press, to thwart challenges, to impose its particular political vision. And so this is not just a party, but it's a project. that also is linked to social mobilization on the ground and at elite levels. So it's a very powerful party with reach across much of the country and into a variety of sectors. Then there's the question of the opposition, which I think is not great. There are states that are held by the opposition, kind of very powerful state-level parties. The question of national coordination has, I think, that ship has kind of sailed for this election. There were ideas that an opposition coalition could be built that could take advantage, in different states and in different seats, put together particular strategies that could identify and exploit BJP weaknesses. We'll see, but I think the odds thus far are not great, right? And so this combination of a very powerful BJP, dominant party, a very weak opposition, has facilitated the BJP's kind of, really control of the state and its penetration, but also mobilization of society. And so this takes on a variety of forms. Some are kind of cultural, others involve use of the state apparatus in various ways, some of which are very similar to what Congress did in the past, some of which are quite different. But I think that's the landscape we're now in, of a dominant party that is likely to continue being dominant, at least in the near future. The medium-term future and beyond, I never want to predict in Indian politics. But I think that gives a sense of what this will look like, kind of mobilization, extension, all in the face of an opposition that's really flailing in a lot of ways to build a national level kind of counterpoise to BJP power.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, in the lead up to the election, to talk about the opposition, the Modi government has arrested several opposition figures, including the chief minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal. The Modi government also froze the bank accounts of its main rival, the Indian National Congress, which, as Professor Sandlin said, had ruled India for decades. In this context of a shrinking space for opposition, for civil society, media, academia, there's this narrative about India's growth story, and I wanted to ask you about that, Ms. Gauri Ahmed. You have advised Fortune 500 companies on how to navigate India's investment landscape. I wanted to ask, how much of India's tremendous growth, and it's on track to becoming the world's third largest economy, potentially in the next few years, how much of that is due to Modi government policy, and how do voters, both in India and in the diaspora, weigh kind of this growth story against this other narrative about deteriorating democratic conditions?
Thanks, Emily, and thank you all for this conversation today. So I have been advising companies on market entry strategies into India for the last several years, and I have to say that over the last decade, there's been an incredible boom in sort of US companies and global companies who are trying to get their foothold in India right now. You mentioned their sort of economic growth. They're currently the 5th largest economy. They've surpassed their former colonizers, the UK, which they're very proud of. Last year, they overtook China as the most populous country in the world, growing middle class, growing GDP. Like, all of the numbers indicate that there's a growing middle class that's consuming, that is looking for growth. They're looking for sort of, there's huge opportunities economically. And so that's why we're seeing multinationals, US companies, tech companies, everybody sort of looking at India as the next growth opportunity. What's their plan for the next 10 years? And then simultaneously, you have sort of the US-China tension and looking at India as this counterweight to China right now, and US companies who are looking to manufacture in India, and how can they develop and sort of build out their supply chains in India as a balance and a counterweight to China. And so all of that is happening right now at this moment. And so I do think a lot of those policies, we have to give credit where credit is due. And I think the BJP and Prime Minister Modi have made a lot of development on infrastructure. You've seen new airports, new flyovers, new roads and bridges, and trains and metros, and they're improving people's lives, I think, in some ways economically. I think there's a lot of national pride that comes into some of the policies that he's implemented. They're one of the fourth country to land on the moon. As an emerging market, I think there's a lot of pride. And as someone who's Indian American, I think there is pride in those sorts of developments and the pace that's developed over the last 10 years or so. But I do think many challenges remain. The ease of doing business in India remains an incredibly challenging environment for companies to navigate the bureaucracy. Foreign direct investment for companies, their caps are still in place, for example, for US companies who are trying to invest so that they can't become majority investors in certain sectors. So Indian companies remain majority investors. Youth unemployment is somewhere around 80% in parts of the country, which is incredibly high. Women's workforce participation is incredibly low, somewhere around 20 to 30%. So these numbers indicate that India really does have a long way to go to becoming what they want to be as the next manufacturing hub like China. And will that happen in the near term? I think there's a long way to go for them to really see themselves as part of that solution. And one of the things that you touched on, Paul, is sort of the regional disparities. So you'll see in South India, and I can say this because I'm South Indian, is you'll see a lot of development, economic development. You'll see the differences between North India and South India. And ironically, or not ironically, the BJP they're not in power in many of those South Indian states. Education is run by the states in those states. And a lot of those policies are in place at the state level. And so you're seeing a difference in economic empowerment take place at between the South and the North. So I do think there's a lot of credit where credit needs to be given for the Modi government, but a lot of challenges remain, and I think a lot of inequality remains between different groups. You're seeing income inequality in widening gaps between the haves and the have-nots, and I think that continues to be an incredibly large problem. And one of the things is I was in India last month, but I was also in India last year during the G20, and I always remember when I land in Mumbai, there's one of the largest slums in Asia is when you land into Mumbai, the airport, and you see it, and it's just one of those sort of it's something that is very jarring when you land into India. And during the G20 summit, they had covered it up with these large banners and posters to try to hide it from view. And so I think these are sort of short-term solutions that I think the Modi government has taken rather than really looking at that income inequality. And so I think there are bigger issues at play, and how that factors into the US-India relationship is another one, and sort of the economic relationship that the US is bolstering. So maybe we can touch on that later.
Yeah, absolutely. But to return to the question of the conditions for anyone who's not on board with the BJP, and what civil society groups continue to say is sort of deteriorating democracy. What we've also observed is that a strident Hindu nationalism that has been invoked by this government has been accompanied by a crackdown on dissent and a tacit support for violence against some minority communities, most notably Muslims. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Nawaz, what would Mr. Modi's continued hold on power mean for India's 200 million Muslims? Also, how would another Modi term be viewed by the larger Muslim world, including by its longtime nemesis and neighbor Pakistan, which recently had its own elections? And lastly, how can we understand what polls suggest, what various surveys suggest will be an increase in the share of votes from Muslims in India for the BJP in these elections?
As you know, I grew up as a neighbor of India in Pakistan, and then have been in the US since '72. but I continue to be involved with the region. And after I left the IMF in 2005, I was with the Atlantic Council and launched the South Asia Center. That meant that I spent the next 6 years or so essentially waging peace in the region between India and Pakistan. And so a lot of my knowledge is firsthand from many visits to India and from relationships with people there. But I'm also reflecting a lot of the excellent work that is being done, particularly in the Washington think tanks by people at Carnegie Endowment and other think tanks that follow India on a very detailed day-to-day basis. So a lot of what I say reflects the research that they have done or that the Pew Center has done. I just want to go back to 2014, because in this election, I think there is a general understanding that Prime Minister Modi is on his way to becoming the most powerful and perhaps eventually the longest serving Prime Minister of India. Prime Minister Nehru completed 17 years before he passed. And if Prime Minister Modi wins this election, as he's expected to, and enters another term, in 2029, when he turns 78 years of age, he will have an opportunity to surpass Pandit Nehru in the Indian history. And I think that's no mean feat. And I think one has to acknowledge how he managed to rise in 2014, an election that I observed firsthand because I was traveling in India at that time. When his coalition bagged something like 336 Lok Sabha seats, and he became the political glue that pulled the NDA together. And he became the voice and the face of the NDA, because before that he had been a regional politician in Gujarat, and he effectively sold the idea of the great development that he said had occurred in Gujarat. It became a national story and then an international story. Of course, many people challenged the numbers on that, but it's all in the marketing. And so I want to just remind people that he is a master of the craft, and I think one has to acknowledge that. Ogilvy and Mather gave him a slogan, which was, "Ab ki baar Modi Sarkar," and then "Achhe din aane wale hain." They, in fact, were not original. They riffed on a slogan that Atal Bihari Vajpayee had used very successfully in his campaign, which was
The previous BJP.
the previous BJP Prime Minister, who, in fact, was also famous for having tried to make peace with Pakistan. And his slogan was, "Sabko dekha bari bari, ab ki baar Atal Bihari." So it was quite clear where the idea had come from for this slogan of Modi Sarkar, and that slogan is surviving to this day. Opposed to this, you talked of Congress and their hold on the public imagination. They had a really clunky and vague slogan, which was "Har Haath Shakti, Har Haath Tarakki." Now, for the ordinary man, particularly in the countryside, this kind of vague generalization didn't seem attractive, and there was nothing to hold on to. And so Modi succeeded. The question now is, what will happen beyond Modi? Will the BJP survive? Will he allow a successor like, say, Amit Shah, whom he brought from Gujarat and who is now the interior minister and who is much younger? Or would he allow a handing over of power to the right-wing Hindu Yogi, who is the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh? Or will there be internecine warfare within the BJP, which has occurred before, and he managed to best the old BJP leadership of Jaswant Singh and Yashwant Sinha and retain his control. And so it's unclear whether he will suffer the same kind of fate that we are seeing perhaps Erdogan heading towards in Turkey, where one single personality dominates the scene so much, like a banyan tree, that it refuses to allow anything else to grow under its shade. You talked of the Hindu support for him, and in 2019, Pew did some very good numbers on the elections, and it was quite clear that his Hindu support was predominantly in the north, northeast, and the central regions. In the south, he has the lowest Hindu support. It's only 19%, which is fascinating. Although nationwide, almost about half the population of the Hindu population of India supported him. Congress continues to have a foothold in the south and in the center, although they've lost Chhattisgarh to the BJP recently. And I think it's important that we also remember that when Pew did their survey in 2019, only some 68% of Hindus considered religion to be very important in their lives. So we shouldn't put too much weight on that. I think the factors that Safia pointed out, the economic factors, the opportunity for women, the oppressed classes, those are going to be critical. Finally, I just want to say a few words about the Muslim question inside India. And this is interesting that surprisingly for a prime minister and a party that used a hard line against the minority Muslim populations as a selling point, he has been very strategic in dividing the Muslim vote in India and dividing it to his advantage. He doesn't treat it the way everyone else in India and outside India looks at the Muslim population as a homogeneous whole. He divides it up by sect, by class, by caste, using the caste system that people are familiar with to be able to break away portions of the Hindu population in support of the BJP. And so the three groups are the Ashraf, the Ajlaf, and the Arzal. The Ashraf are the elite descendants of people who came into India from the Arabian Peninsula and Central Asia. And then you have the Ajlaf, who were the people who converted. And the Arzal are the ones who are the equivalent of the untouchables, the Dalits. They continue to be Muslims, but they are still considered as untouchables. And he managed successfully by giving extra rights to the Shia population in India to break them away from the Muslim groups. And that's how he successfully won Uttar Pradesh, the former United Provinces, where the cultural capital of Muslim India was Lucknow. And the Shia are now 25% of the 200 million that you referred to as the Muslim population of India. So that's a substantial chunk, particularly from that northern belt, that is now aligned with him. The other big group that is aligned with him are the what they call the OBC, the other backward classes, which are the poorest in the caste system of the Muslims, the people who are still treated as untouchables. Mm-hmm. They found that he accepts them and he reaches out to them, and so they will vote for him. So the future role for India, very generally, I just want to throw out 2 or 3 things. One, it has to first be a regional power. And in order to be a regional power, India will have to lead in the economic integration of the region that it inhabits. And that means building a relationship with Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and even Pakistan. Because without trade.
May I interject here and just say that at the moment, it could be argued it's not doing that. That
it's not.
China is doing that, and the Belt and Road Initiative and in many other ways.
Yes, and like Safia, I'm simply laying out what are the desirable actions that we will see, and we can then test whether he's heading in the right direction after his his famous victory in these elections. So that will be one. The other is the domestic shakeup that is needed. India still has one of the lowest levels of fiscal devolution in the major economies of the world, which means that at the community level, at the city level, people aren't able to collect taxes and use them for their own benefits. The state government or the central government has a dead hand on all those revenues and refuses to allow the kind of freedom that is necessary that we see in this country, for instance, at the county level. I've already talked of regional integration. Trade with neighbors is going to be critical. India's trade with Pakistan is less than $2 billion when it took place. It's no longer taking place after Imran Khan shut the border once the 370 was revoked for Kashmir. It can be 40 to 100 billion if it goes back to the same proportion of trade that existed between the areas that's now Pakistan and India in 1947. Just going back to that proportion would raise it between 40 and 100 billion dollars. That's what the studies are showing. And then increasing labor mobility inside India to be able to move people where they're needed. And this is really where the divide between the North and the South will become very critical, that the barriers to this mobility have to be increased. And finally, I want to re-emphasize Safia's point. India's labor participation rate for women is 27%, compared with 37% in Bangladesh. And that is the reason why Bangladesh's per capita income today exceeds that of India. So these are some of the benchmarks that we'll be looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to touch on a number of those things. I want to return to you, Professor Staniland. India is talking a great deal these days about a multipolar world where its historic policy of non-alignment serves it quite well, because with the United States and Russia busy engaged in several conflicts, it can decide its trading positions according to its own self-interest. But at the same time, the United States is trying mightily, as are other powers, to woo India to its side. You have written recently about the US and India having aligned themselves when it comes to regional security and when it comes to China. Can you talk about that a little, and also speak about where their interests diverge?
Sure. So I think a lot of Indian policymakers use this language kind of a sweet spot, in which India is on good terms with Russia, right, at a time when the West is not, right, is needed as a counterweight and an alternative to China, both economically, technologically, militarily. So I think India sees itself, they use this phrase multi-alignment, right, as this ability to kind of, sit at the center of a web of relationships without having to decisively choose one block or another. And I think right now that's working fairly well for Delhi. I think a Trump administration could throw some wrenches into the works in terms of stability and predictability. But I think that's kind of the vision that India has right now. I think the United States views India, as has been talked about, as an economic alternative, right, for things like supply chains, also as a military kind of partner, not an ally, but a partner in the Indo-Pacific, also to some extent kind of on continental land borders, as along the India-China border, where there's been a long-running territorial dispute that flared into a violent conflict in 2020. So that's kind of the global picture. I think India's in an interesting position because it is globally rising. But as was mentioned earlier, in the region, it faces a variety of challenges. Now, I think the last couple of years have actually been quite good for India in Sri Lanka, Nepal, maybe Bangladesh. But China is much more in the region than it has been ever, especially economically. I mean, it was there via the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. But this is a new form of Chinese influence. And so on the one hand, India is rising globally, but pressed in new ways, I think, within its region. And it's kind of an unusual combination. You don't always see that as great powers rise or as major powers rise. I think the US is generally broadly aligned with India. I think there are a few areas of potential divergence. I can speak more to kind of the political military side. Others can speak to technology and economics, where there are areas of divergence. I think there's a kind of a mutual abandonment concern or an assurance concern when it comes to China, right? Which is the US wants India to really get out there, right, and join a balancing coalition. And, to some extent, India shares deep concerns about China. There's a disputed territory, disputed border, I should say, Chinese influence in the region, growing Chinese military capabilities, both, continental and naval. On the other hand, India is a lot smaller than China. It has many other pressing priorities to which it could divert its resources. And so getting locked in an arms race with China, which is, much larger economically, is problematic. It's not ideal. It's a second best outcome rather than the ideal, which would be some kind of rapprochement, de-escalation on the border. That seems unlikely, but would be, a more efficient strategy, a more efficient outcome for India. So I think there's this delicate dance, and there are concerns that the US could always just go home, right? America is very far from Asia. It is an Asian power, but there's always this fear of what Indians sometimes call a G2, between China and the US, this kind of sphere of influence order in which India would get frozen out or marginalized. And so it's this game of back and forth assurance that no, we'll be there for you, but not too much, and in this contingency, but maybe not that one, that I think is playing out. And so that's one area where you could see divergences. There's also sometimes regional divergences, and we saw this most recently in the Bangladeshi election. So Sheikh Hasina, the incumbent, won a resounding re-election under conditions I think it's fair to say were not especially free and fair. The US put out some fairly strong statements against the electoral process in Bangladesh. India, however, was really very careful to continue to stay on side with Sheikh Hasina, who's seen as a hedge against Islamist influence and also someone who is willing to play ball with India rather than tilting toward China. And so the US and India actually had quite divergent public statements about the Bangladeshi election. And so there are these kind of questions about democracy, rights, values that the US sometimes pops up and says things that Delhi disagrees with in the region. So that's something else to look out for. So those are a few areas of, I think mostly alignment, but these lurking potential divergences or tensions that still exist.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a footnote on the politico-military aspect that Paul was talking about, because I had a lot of dealings with Indian military leaders, particularly the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arun Prakash, who became a good friend, and we spent many hours talking about India's role in the region. And a lot of what I got from the Indian military leadership was that they would prefer not to be part of PACOM, which was the way the DoD had divided the world. The Pentagon, headquarters of PACOM was so far away in Hawaii that they didn't see it relevant to them. They wanted to be part of CENTCOM. And it's interesting, the US government divides the world differently from the DoD. The State Department has Central and South Asia in one bureau. And many of the Indians that I dealt with, the military leaders, said we would prefer to be in CENTCOM. Why? Because India's force projection and trade interests are in the littoral states of the Indian Ocean. So they stretch from Indonesia all the way to South Africa, and they include the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. Whereas the US is trying to force India into becoming a Pacific partner against China. Now, traditionally, and my friends at the DoD don't read a lot of history sometimes, which they should, but I would show them the map of the Chola kingdom, and I would tell them that India actually had not just influence, but suzerainty over large territories of what is now Southeast Asia. And those links and ties have remained, and trade has continued. And I think you have to recognize that India's future will be in the Indian Ocean, not in the Pacific. And I think that the short-term thinking in the US is always, well, we are now looking at the Pacific, so the rest of the world will come to a halt. As we discovered, October 7th occurred, and suddenly the Middle East has become the center of gravity for decision-making in DC. So we have to be careful and recognize that India, like China, is thinking long-term, whereas the US is still very much not able to look over the horizon in making policies. Every 2 years, every 4 years, we have these elections, and everything is decided on that basis.
Well, what do you think, Ms. Gloria Ahmed, do you think that the Biden administration would welcome a third term because of its short-sightedness? It would rather just have some continuity in India, despite the fact that there are these divergences on trade, on political alignments, and increasingly on human rights, although it doesn't seem to have any real implications for the way that India and the government sort of manage. But the State Department has been more vocal recently, I think, about some of its objections to the way that minority populations are being treated in India.
Yeah, I mean, I can just reflect a little bit on the last summer when Prime Minister Modi came for his second state visit. I mean, the red carpet was rolled out. He's addressed the joint session of Congress for the second time, which was like, I think only two heads of state had been given that honor. And his state dinner was sort of a glitzy gala with all of the sort of top CEOs from around the country attending. And so I think there's been a warm welcome after that visit. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said India is one of the most consequential relationships for the United States. So I do think this is, having worked on India from inside the US government and now outside the US government, I would have to say this is probably the strongest language that I've seen and the strongest embrace that I've seen from the US-India, in terms of the US-India relationship. I think you talked about it a little bit, and I touched on some of the commercial ties, but if you look at some of the deals that were announced in that visit, I mean, Micron, a US company, is making over $1 billion investment in India right now. And then you look at Indian companies who are purchasing defense equipment from a US company like GE. And that comes with a lot of trust and a long time coming in terms of those conversations for those deals. And so there's now these strengthened economic ties between US and Indian companies. And I think that's really something that's strengthening that relationship between government to government. And that means even as India continues to pursue positions which it calls strategic autonomy. So I was just in India last month, and the Minister of External Affairs gets very defensive and was talking about, India is going to do what's in India's best interest. And if that means purchasing cheaper Russian oil or, taking positions which are non-aligned with the US, then it's going to take those positions because it's what's in India's best interest. So I think for the US and for the Biden administration, the US needs India over the long term on a range of issues, climate change. We need India, the US government needs India to lean in on climate change policy. We need India to lean in on when it comes to disruptions in AI. We need India to lean in on positioning itself as a counterweight to China. We need India when it comes to strengthening economic ties with US companies. And so because of that relationship, I think the US government and the Biden administration in some ways has sort of looked away when it comes to some of these issues like that allegations that the prime minister is stifling the opposition. I mean, arresting the Aam Aadmi Party leadership 30 days before the election and, making sure that they're not out and sort of contesting elections on the streets is a serious issue in the lead up to the elections, or with the disqualification of Rahul Gandhi last year. And so I think there's sort of a looking away in some ways because of those stronger strategic alliances. And so, we're seeing discriminatory legislation, for example, come out with the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was recently enacted. And this is really, and I can talk about it from
could we unpack that a little bit?
I'll unpack that a little bit because it's I have a sort of personal perspective to it. I was in India last month, meeting with government officials and there for this Ministry of External Affairs conference. But I stopped in Hyderabad and visited my family first. And my aunt, who's in her 80s, was frantic about looking for her birth certificate because the Citizenship Amendment Act allows for Christians, basically everyone who's not Muslim, Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, who are coming into India, it grants them citizenship rights. So it's a litmus test for citizenship in India. And the law says on paper that it doesn't impact Muslims who are in India, who are currently citizens of India, but many people in India and of that generation aren't able to actually prove with documentation that they are citizens and that they have birth certificates. And so there was this frantic sort of frenzy around being able to find these documents and prove, as Indian Muslims, that they are in fact citizens. And there was conversations around where would we go if we had to leave the country, having spent our whole lives here. And so these sorts of conversations, this sort of legislation in the lead up to elections really does marginalize those populations, and it creates these tensions that are really dangerous and make it difficult as a US ally. The democratic backsliding make it difficult for the US to ally itself in many ways, even though it needs India as a strategic and economic ally.
Okay, and just quickly, because we're going to go to questions in a few minutes, I'd love for each of you to weigh in briefly on where we go from these elections. What does it mean more broadly for democracies in the world to see the world's largest democracy potentially, continue an administration that has kind of become synonymous with democratic backsliding? Do you want to start?
Sure. So first I'm going to plug, because I'm an academic, there's a July 2023, the Journal of Democracy has a symposium on Is Indian Democracy in Danger? Really recommend anyone interested. It's like 4 articles kind of taking different views of the question. So on this question of democratic backsliding. So, and we can talk about in Q&A if people are interested, kind of what the different positions are. I think India represents a style of democracy that is broadly, electorally democratic, but often with kind of a somewhat tilted playing field. This has been true in the past as well, but I think it's certainly accurate today, right? And this is not unique to India. I think you saw it very much in the most recent Indonesian election, another massive democratic country in which the outgoing president's, family is now coming back into power in ways, as a vice president, in ways that really saw the state administration tilting to one side, right? And so these are not kind of your classic liberal democracies that, Freedom House likes to score, but they're also not really autocracies in the sense that political scientists usually talk about them. They're kind of a blend, a combination of different attributes of regimes that I think we just need to understand much better how they function, the points of stability and instability. But I think this is much more common than kind of like the Danish model of perfect liberal democracy, certainly in South and Southeast Asia. So I think in some ways it's the wave of the future. I think we can talk more in Q&A about how to characterize it. But I don't think it's an aberration. I think it's representative of at least some trends that are much broader and much more common across the world today.
Sophia?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I look at it from sort of an economic perspective, I think the next sort of 5 to 10 years could be India's sort of shining moment in terms of economic prosperity and growth. But as some of the issues that we touched on, I think these sort of rifts and sort of looking at, what happens after Prime Minister Modi, and could it be this more divisive, more divisive along religious lines? If that sort of pattern continues, I think you are going to see investors really think about what states they want to go into. I think you're going to see them wanting to eliminate risk, as all businesses do, and companies really are going to question whether it makes sense to go invest in markets where there's, the lack of freedom of expression and the lack of journalistic expression and the treatment of women, the treatment of minorities. I mean, all of these factors create economic risk. And that's my advice, and that would be my advice in terms of the next, moving forward, is to really sort of look at that secular model that India was created upon, to sort of to push forward that economic growth over the next few years.
Okay, and Mr. Nawaz, very briefly, since I know we have many questions.
I'll just make 2 points. One, if India goes to the extreme right, it will produce an equal and opposite reaction in Pakistan, where the extreme right Islamists will demand power simply because of what's happening across the border. So there's a possible danger there. The second thing is really what I'd like to end on, which is I remain an optimist about the region. I think South Asia can and should be the center of gravity for global and regional development, with India as the center, but as an integrated region. And the demographics of the region are militating towards that. Most of the population is young in the whole region, and they talk to each other even when the governments don't talk to each other. And so the example that I cite is of the transition in Senegal, an area that I'm familiar with because I worked on the Gambia when I was at the IMF briefly, working on a program there. And in Senegal, you had an election where a guy who was in jail a few weeks ago was elected president. And the previous president actually conceded and congratulated him. And there was no violence and no denial of the results of the election. So there is a model. It doesn't have to be the Danish model. I'll call it the Senegal model that exists, that India and the other countries in the region can follow.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have a question here. If people want to just line up, yes, thank you.
My name is Neha. I'm a second-year undergraduate, and my question is, for the Congress Party or other opposition, do you see a path forward where they can be successful in the next election, or what would your recommendations for them be?
Oh, man. So, okay, this is just my take, and it could be totally wrong, but it draws from Rahul Verma at the CPR, the Center for Policy Research, who's writing a book on Congress and kind of party decline. The Congress is in big trouble, in part because it's still a dynastic party, but it's an incompetent dynastic party. It's the worst, I mean, to be blunt, and I don't say that like out of hostility toward Congress, it's just not very good at politics. So I think a Congress in which you get hungry aspirants who kind of get rewards for winning elections, and the leadership is open in a brutal political competition, that's going to produce electoral winners who see advantages to kind of winning elections and being able to move up. That's not what Congress has right now. So if I were the Congress leadership, I would probably step aside and open up a period of intense internal political competition, acknowledging that could also tear the party apart, right? Because maybe it's just held together by kind of the remnants of the dynasty. But I don't see an alternative path forward to then like really getting out there and rewarding people who can win elections, often in a very brutal way. Like, factional warfare that eventually consolidates around some people who can win. Is that going to happen? Probably not, but that would be my advice.
Does anyone else want to address how the opposition rises to the occasion?
I mean, I think, the Modi government and the BJP have really used technology and social media and really gotten to all parts of India and really, sort of utilized, they've been great on messaging, right? And I think Rahul Gandhi did recently that sort of 40-day, stint where he visited all these villages. And I think they need to do more of that, where they're sort of getting out of their little bubble and they're getting out to the public, and they need to utilize some of these techniques, which I think the Modi government used the Obama playbook a little bit in sort of thinking about how they do their social media marketing and campaigning. And so I think the Congress Party is really behind in sort of how they do that, and that could be something that they use to get out to young people and market a little better.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year MPP from India, from Maharashtra specifically. Before coming here, I was involved with the issue of OBC caste census and the OBC's census issue. And in 2019, Bharatiya Janata Party and the leaders like Amit Shah and Rajnath Singh specifically declared in Parliament that if OBCs elect us again, we are going to conduct the OBC caste census, which has been the case, not has been the case since 1931 from the British India. So we have this dilemma where India is growing at the rapid pace of economical scale, but the country which is conducting census of donkeys and pigs and cows and buffaloes are not even recognizing the human dignity of OBC masses. So we see that a huge atrocities on human dignity in India specific. I think my question here is, when we are going through this election this year, we also see a huge support from Indian diaspora. And again, the Indian diaspora in UK and Europe is also mostly an upper caste diaspora from Hindu section and also from Muslim section, Ashrafs. So this, mostly the Hindus have been the backbone of funding, ideological support, technological support, and kind of a strategic ideological backyard for the Hindu right, specifically the RSS. So how you see this diaspora playing a role, and can we say that the cultural global ideology of Hindu nationalism is also a pan-global ideology? So how Western policymakers, specifically in Europe and in US, recognizing this inherent threat? Thank you.
Can I attempt this?
Please.
Because I've been thinking about this. I led a policy group for the Aspen Institute to India some years ago. And one of the groups we met there was a nascent political party of overseas Indians who had invested in India. They were putting money and they were going to have a pilot project of 10 candidates that they would support in Indian elections to see if they could actually displace the traditional parties. So my suggestion would be to look at the numbers. Overseas Indians send something like $125 billion in remittances to India every year. That's 3.4% of the Indian GDP. That's a lot of money. And you can use your influence from overseas, even though Indians aren't allowed dual citizenship, so they can't vote. And only 180,000 people, I think, are registered to vote from overseas in Indian elections. It's a very small number. But look at the numbers that you're citing. In the US, actually, the pro-right-wing Hindu groups in the diaspora are less than a third of the Hindu population that lives in the United States. This is the research that is being done on the political views of the diaspora in the US. And I suspect that it's probably the same in Western Europe. I don't know what it is in the Arabian Peninsula. There'll probably be many more Muslims there in the Gulf states. And so it's possible that the diaspora can be that trigger to the change that Paul was talking about, away from a dynastic system to one based on the quality of candidates. That's all.
Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Vakar. I'm from Pakistan. I'm a first-year MPP student. My question is that we are witnessing a very different trend in Asia, and it's not about Modi or Muslims or whatever he is doing. It's about like the way things are changing. Like US or West always talks about freedom of speech, transparency, democratic regimes. But in Pakistan, what happened? Like they have put the Imran Khan behind the bar and all the party leaders behind the bar and let one party win. And now it's India. Like now it's happening in India, supporting by US. Like, everything is happening. They are putting the chief minister behind the bar, all party leaders behind the bar, freezing opposition bank accounts. So my question is that, the economic growth is tremendous and we feel like the policies must continue. But where are we heading? Like, are we, raising another China where one party will rule it and nobody's saying, anything? US, even for Pakistan or for India, neither one statement, like everyone is supporting all good. So my question is, what are the other things that's rising in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and there is something new happening in that part of the world. So my point was like how you see, what are the downturns and other things that's happening in these regions. Thank you.
I mean, I'll be cynical. I don't think Western policymakers, number one, I don't think deep down they care that much about a lot of these things when push really comes to shove. I think that's a very clear historical pattern. Obviously, there are exceptions and caveats, and I don't want to push it too far, but in the midst of great power competition, the U.S. is not generally monkeying around too much with liberal values. The other thing, though, is I think U.S. influence in a lot of these places is quite limited. I mean, how is the U.S. going to shake the foundations of Sheikh Hasina's regime in Bangladesh? Right? It's not. And I think that's a calculation that the U.S. has made both in Pakistan and India. It's like, what are we going to do about this, right? And so we're just going to kind of bob and weave and look away and put out statements and hope that it all works out, right? Because the BJP would love it if the State Department put out a statement every day saying, you need to be better Democrats. It's catnip for the BJP. They'd say, oh, look at these, the liberal hypocrites in the West telling us how we can be Democrats. Yep. Right? They'd love it. So I think, on the one hand, I'm very cynical about U.S. policy. On the other hand, I'm not sure what I'd do differently, because what are we going to do, right? So it's not to discount what you're arguing. I agree with it, and also the U.S. has very limited influence in large parts of Asia. And I think we need to be fairly humble about some of this, especially inside the domestic politics of these very large, complicated, and very proudly autonomous countries.
Do you agree or disagree, Mr. Navas? I see you shaking your head, and I'm thinking about Pakistan here, where we thought the U.S. had quite a lot of influence for a long time.
I've written 2 books on this subject. Unfortunately, the U.S. has not covered itself with glory in terms of supporting democracy in Pakistan. It loves autocrats, it loves dictators because they get things done. And this is not recent. It began with Kissinger, who was very cynical about the way he approached these things. Today, I'll give you some numbers. Pakistan is receiving, or will receive in 2025, no more than $108 million of assistance, economic and military combined. $108 million today will buy you a cup of coffee in Starbucks if you're the Pentagon. So that's my cynical approach to it. Within the last week, we had a very anodyne statement sent by the President of the United States to the new Prime Minister of Pakistan that didn't even say, congratulations, you've been elected. It didn't mention counterinsurgency. It didn't mention any of the issues that the people in Pakistan are talking about. The statement was sent out saying the US stands by you, et cetera, and we'll be your partners. So this is all a fiction, unfortunately. And I think particularly the youth in Pakistan now are onto it. They're fully aware of it, and they discount any official statement coming from Washington.
And I think if I can just chime in on that, because I do, having worked inside the State Department, having worked and drafted some of these statements, it's incredibly complicated and tricky to try to figure out, because too much praise gets you in trouble, too little praise gets you in trouble. So saying nothing is probably best. And so you come out with these sort of statements which are kind of, bland, and it's very, very difficult to thread the needle in figuring out, because you don't want to interfere in internal politics, but you also want to show that you're supporting a Democrat, and so it's very, very difficult for the administration and for the State Department when they do put out these statements. And that's why you will see some of them. You'll be like, are you actually saying something? Because it's a very delicate balance.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Gabriel. I'm a first year in the college, and I'm wondering, given some of the recent difficulties and failures the BRI has faced in countries like Sri Lanka and Indonesia, and some of China's foreign policy missteps vis-a-vis nation states like the Philippines, does India have an opportunity in Southeast Asia to counter some of that influence? And, if so, can they do it, and are they interested in doing so?
Great question.
Can I just I want to talk about Nepal, because nobody talks about Nepal, but I was there in January for research. And so I think this is an area where there is substantial Chinese influence, and this is from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, though, anyway, whatever. There's a lot going on in Myanmar. I think the BRI is an important thing. I think China is obviously a very important actor. I also think China, like the US, like India, faces real challenges in achieving its goals in these smaller or third-party states. So I think India has been very involved in Nepal. They really messed something up in 2015. They basically created a blockade of Nepal, had to do with like battles over the new constitution. There was a big backlash against India and Nepal. And China kind of got substantial influence in that period after 2015. And India's been quite good about reacting and kind of toning down its traditionally very hectoring tone toward Nepal. I think you've seen something similar in Sri Lanka as well, kind of trying to pick up some of the pieces of the Sri Lankan economic crisis. So I think India has adopted, kind of ironically, given that I think the foreign minister is very prone to kind of a certain kind of hectoring and lecturing. In the region, they've been forced to kind of walk much more softly and much more carefully, in part because China is there as an alternative now in ways that just weren't true in like 1994. So I think there are real opportunities for India, but some of those opportunities come from the fact that they're now much more hard-pressed in the region, and they've had to adapt and figure out smarter ways to deal with these states that look to China as, providing some real opportunities.
Right, and if we could talk about that a little bit, right? We've got this Adani port project in Sri Lanka, but by and large, there hasn't been a great deal of foreign investment from India in South Asia compared to China. Why is that? And do you think that the government and Indian businesses are recognizing that they should be planting more flags?
I think they are, and I think we're going to be seeing more of that. You're seeing more of that. You just mentioned the Adani port, and you're seeing more growth from other sort of the big Indian conglomerates who are growing regionally. But I did want to add, if you looked at India's COVID diplomacy, that was a huge moment where India kind of showed up and provided vaccines and filled a huge void for vaccinations regionally, right, in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And so I think they're looking to step into that role, and they're looking to fill that void. So we're going to see more of that.
Although I would say there was the whole mishap.
There was the whole mishap.
The government saying, actually, no, we need those vaccines ourselves.
For ourselves.
So we're not going to be able
yes.
to deliver to Sri Lanka. And then China did step in again. So there hasn't been a
consistency.
Yeah.
Also on Nepal, a footnote. Remember, Paul, India worked out an agreement with Nepal to buy all its hydroelectric power.
Right.
But on its terms. And it basically locked the Nepalese into that arrangement, which was not suitable for the Nepalese at all. And so they need to renegotiate that. And that allowed the Chinese an opening to come in and say to the Nepalese, look, we can actually help you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question. I think we have time for just one or two more.
All right. My name is Yang, graduate student from sociology. Modi is considered the most popular populist in the world, and he's very strategic, not only having the support from the Hindu nationalists, but also knobbing off some section of Muslim community to his support. But there is an element of neoliberal overdrive in Indian economy, and we see that the richest guy in Asia is from India today. So I wonder if there is an element of plutocratic populism in Indian democracy, and if this mix or brew of democracy is successful in the next 20 years, and India become a behemoth, even compared to China, I wonder if this electoral democracy, or let's say democracy with Indian characteristics, challenge the gold standard of liberal democracy, and how should the US engage with this new theory or new perspective of democracy in the future?
Yeah, so there's a lot of money in India, and a lot of it sloshes around into political parties' coffers and politicians' bank accounts. That's been true for a long time, but the scale now is enormous. There's a great book by James Crabtree called Billionaire Raj, which is about kind of just the huge inequalities, but incredible concentrations of wealth. So the question is this sustainable? I would say a lot of countries have shown that high levels of income inequality, concentration of plutocracy are totally compatible with something like minimalist electoral democracy. I think the United States is a great example of that, like to be blunt, right? So I think some variant of this is perfectly sustainable, but it's going to be characterized by extremely opaque campaign finance, tight links between the state, whoever's in power in the state and big business corporations, both at the national and the state level, right? I think that's what this will look like. It already looks like that, and I don't see any reason to think it'll change.
So the Supreme Court did just rule that the previously extremely opaque electoral bond system had to be slightly more transparent. Do you think that that will have any impact on the elections or on how campaigns are run going forward?
No. I mean, I wish I could say yes. I think Indian corporate elites and politicians going back decades, including under like the early Congress, 1950s, 60s, have found all kinds of very creative and brilliant ways to move money around. So, you know.
I mean, I have to say that there has been more reporting about, for example, how the Ambanis have been, you know, the wealthiest man in Asia, have been supporting, you know, because of this electoral bond transparency. There's been more reporting about where this money is coming from in a way that we haven't seen in the past. So I think that's helpful. And we're seeing sort of those sort of top 5 to 10 families who are sort of huge funders of the BJP. And then on the flip side, sort of get you know, see the favors come out in different ways on the flip side. I think you're going to see more of those correlations with more transparency.
It's the ultimate pork barrel politics, because you now find data on the number of firms that belong to these oligarchs that were under investigation, and those are the ones that are giving most money through the electoral bonds system to the BJP. So there's been a direct correlation between the donation of money through the bond system to the BJP. Unfortunately, that's the way it's been going on in Russia and China and now in India, and of course in the US.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ashirwad. I am first year MPP student. So I have like 2 questions. One question is about like how government and Supreme Court of India is having their own tussle where in the last month Supreme Court ruling electoral bond unconstitutional. At the same time, Government of India coming up with the proposal of setting a own committee to appoint like judiciary, whereas like current system has a collegium where like 5 senior judges of Supreme Court takes all the decision. And so the current conflict in between Supreme Court and government, how do you look at this conflict? At the same time, whenever like there are a talk or like when people talk about India, people, I feel like the main factor that matters even on international platform is caste. The caste composition of India, where the core voter of BJP, what do we call OBCs, the majority of the South Indian populations are OBC. Like almost every Indian state has like more than 50% of population is OBC. So like how do you look at like how do you look at caste factor, like the affirmative action policies in India? Like the last student asked about like how do you look at like caste census? So how all these questions will affect India as a democracy further?
Enormous question. But yeah, let's talk about caste. I'm not sure we have time for both questions, but the question of caste, how does that factor in?
I think you probably have more to say
you
than I
probably
do,
have.
honestly.
What has Mr. Modi done differently approaching the caste question in India than his predecessors?
I'm now the expert on the caste system in India. Okay. The numbers indicate that he has very effectively reached out in specific states, and he's smart enough not to try and do it on a national level, in specific states where he wants to undercut the hold of a local political overlord or the Congress party, as he did in Chhattisgarh, for instance. He will approach the OBCs. The party approaches the OBCs, finds out from them what their needs are, meets those needs. And it's retail politics. It's at the local level. And that's what works. And he's very good at it. Not only is he good at it, but people like Amit Shah have cut their teeth on that level of politicking at the local level. So there's no grandiose strategy or statements or policies that are coming out. Now, in terms of controlling the Supreme Court, that is endemic to the whole region. I don't know if you're following what's happening in Pakistan, but on a day-to-day basis, it's the same fight. How do you manage to control the justices? How do you shape the Supreme Court? How do you get rid of people? The military found a way of keeping files on the personal shenanigans of individual judges and showing them the files privately, and then suddenly they announced that they were retiring to spend more time with their family. Mr. Modi hasn't done that, but he's using an indirect method, I think, of galvanizing support for a different way of appointing judges to the Supreme Court. He will have opposition, again, because there is a new breed of young lawyers who are now advocates of the Supreme Court of India who've actually defeated the government on same-sex marriage, for instance, and accepting gays and so on. So they're not going to give up. I think so long as the current system is there, it's going to be a fight.
And I would just add one thing to that is all of this is sort of interconnected even with our own upcoming election, right? And I think all of these countries, as India faces, I mean, India is sort of the next one up as we look at the global calendar, but I think, you know, everyone's sort of looking at what happens here in the US and then what happens in India, and we're looking at each other's playbook and looking at how will the Supreme Court handle these electoral concerns and what's happening in India and how is it playing out in the US and how does it happen in other parts of the world. So it's all very much interconnected.
Yes. Well, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you so much to a wonderful audience and to a spectacular panel. And I'm told there is food upstairs, so we can continue this discussion upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.